I'm Charlie. Hello. I'm a front-end web developer, which is very useful for this kind of conference. It's a good thing. We're off to a good start. And I've been in the industry for a long time. I've been there since the start, weirdly. I've used Internet Explorer 3. I used Netscape 4.7. I used to use Notepad to do all my work on before we had IDEs, 28 kilobits per second modems, and I used to use the font tag in anger. The fact that some people look confused at that, the font tag, makes me feel really old, so thank you for that one. That's a remarkable endorsement of me, thank you. But I've bounced in and out of the industry a lot, and I've been, as well as a web designer, I've been a graphic designer, I've been a VLE admin, I've been a sysadmin, I've been a teacher, I've been to university twice and dropped out once, so please come later and ask me anything about paleontology or IT systems design and try to guess which one I failed at. And as you can tell from my accent, I am actually British. But it's okay, I'm one of those nice British people who likes Europe, which is why I live in beautiful Berlin, which is like one of the best places on earth. Please come and visit it. It's sophisticated. It's a place of 4-star gourmet food, Michelin quality. It's a place of privacy and restraint. A very, very German place where people are quiet and people are respectful. And there in Berlin, I work for Springer Nature. I'm the lead front-end developer for our Berlin department. And you might not have heard of Springer Nature, that's okay, but it is actually one of the largest global scientific and academic publishers. So, it's a big deal. It produces things like Biomed Central, Scientific American, and the eponymous journal Nature. Which has been around since 1869 or something like that. It's, it's old, it's an old big deal. And it's the most cited scientific journal on the planet, so that's fantastic. And all of this is to help scientists be seen by other scientists. I just did a search engine thing for scientists. I think they're all real. I don't know. But I'm not here to talk to you about science. As much as I would love that would be fantastic. I'm here to talk to you about CSS. And I mentioned the font tag earlier, and some people look confused. But when I started out in this industry, that was all we had to design with. I could literally change the color of things. I could change the size of things. And we had these other little weirdos to help us out with stuff. You might be familiar with the table element to help us do layout, and we had the marquee tag to, make things look fantastic. And everything back then was really tightly coupled. Design and content were one and the same thing, which was a bit of a weird thing. It really limited us in many ways. But then came along CSS, which was like this amazing, amazing genius idea. And I was researching this before I came to do the talk, and I didn't realize it was a PhD project done by this guy. I'm going to try and pronounce his name, Haekon William Lee. I don't know, there's an A with an O over it. I don't even know what that means. And a guy called Bert Boss, who's looking really evil there. And they did this at CERN, which blows my mind, man. They were mucking about with antimatter and black holes and probing the inner mysteries of the universe. And then just on the side went, yeah, there you go, that's CSS. Yeah, that is fine. Knock that off. That's brilliant. That's just, it blows my mind. Oh, by the way, I should give a warning, there might be swearing in this, in case there's any kiddies or anything. And it's part of the super trio of languages that make up the World Wide Web. We've got HTML, which is the foundation of everything, and CSS, we love CSS, and JavaScript giving the interaction of stuff. But I just want to do a basic recap of what CSS is before we go any further, because I'm not sure everybody has I didn't press the buttons there. I'm not sure everyone has a complete idea of what CSS is, because, you know, sometimes we come in and we just go straight in and use Bootstrap and stuff like that, and we might not all know the fundamentals. So let's have a little run through of that. So CSS is fundamentally made up of a bunch of declarations. And these are key property value pairs. So, you know, you've got property on the left and value on the right. And each of these controls an aspect of any particular DOM node, you know, tells it what to look like. And there's a lot of properties out there. You know, there's a huge number of properties, but don't worry, you don't have to know them all, you don't have to learn them. That's what search engines are for. The best developers honestly just live on search engines, it's fine. And then the selectors, you know, these selectors, these are the addresses of CSS. And these tell, you know, CSS where to find things. Tells the browser where to look for any particular DOM node. And when you combine these together, you know, you get declarations and selectors together, you get rule sets. And these are probably what we're most familiar with when we think about CSS. This is, you know, your traditional stuff. So CSS is really simple right at the start, but it gets complex really quickly, especially when something called the Cascade gets involved. And the Cascade is not just one thing. You know, the Cascade is actually a complex series of things that are all working together to actually produce, you know, code. And I just want to walk everybody through these now, just so we can have a little look and a little understanding of what those are. So Cascades, it starts really simple. The base one is source order. And that's really lovely. That's just, like if you have multiple selectors of the same rule set, then the last one wins. That's, you know, it's as simple as that. CSS likes to be simple, and that's nice and simple. And similarly, if you have multiple files imported, because you don't normally just have one CSS file, you have loads of them, then conflicts might emerge there. And CSS has a mechanism for that, and it just falls back to source order again. That's lovely. The last imported file wins. Wins, that's very aggressive language, isn't it? The last imported one does the best. Yeah. And some CSS properties inherit from their parents. And this is normally the one that causes people to freak out a little bit, because this is oh my gosh, CSS leaks everywhere, you know? But it's intended to sometimes, and this is a perfect example. This is anything to do with text, color, font family, anything like that inherits. The parent will give it to the child. And that is really deliberate. No, you want that to happen, because you don't want to be defining font family on every single attribute you encounter. That would just be wasteful and just a waste of time. And this is all because typographic rules are universal. You know, there's no point setting them on every single element. Then we have specificity. And there's some like faces there when we talk about specificity. But it's okay, it's fine. Specificity is CSS's conflict resolution mechanism. And it seems complex, but to me, it really helps if you think of it like a terrible 70s game show. Yeah? It's all about points. It's all about the points winning again. So each type of selector is worth, that was spinning effects, amazing. Each selector is worth like a certain number of points, okay? Let's just go through those. So base elements are just worth 1 point. 1 point, that's all. And classes are worth 10 points. IDs are worth 100 points. And inline styles are worth 1,000 points, 1,000 golden points. And you can combine these together. You know, so if you have a class and a base element, that's worth 11, 10 plus 1. ID in a class, 110, 10 plus 100. ID class and a base element, that's 111, 110 and 1. And that's pretty simple, yeah? That's just numbers. Even I can cope with that, and I'm not very good with numbers. And this is all because you might have multiple rule sets pointing at one DOM element. And CSS wants to know, it just wants to let you know, have a way to figure that out. You know, it's a very nice thing. And if the specificity is the same, if the numbers are the same, then CSS will then it falls back to source order. And the last one wins. You know, that's just nice. That's simple again. CSS wants to be simple. But it's not just you writing CSS, though. You think it's just you, but it's not. There's two other people out there writing CSS with you. And the first one is the browser itself. The browser actually has a bunch of built-in style sheets that it makes use of. So, oh goodness, that's a long way up. So, for example, typographic rules, headings, paragraphs, list items, they all come with default styling if you were just to produce a plain HTML page. And that's CSS helping you out. Then there's you, the author. You know, you're writing stuff. You should know about this. But, you know, it's okay if you don't. We've got a typical developer up there. That's what it looks like. More women and more women, people of color in tech, please. You know, do your part. And then there's the user. The user actually has the ability to write style sheets, even though we never really think about this. And it's imported last. You know, we talked about source order. This is source order. The user stuff comes in last. And they actually use this for a lot of useful things. Talking about accessibility, we've heard some wonderful talks about accessibility. This is part of that. People with neurological conditions such as dyslexia, for example, will want to set their own fonts on a website. So they might put Comic Sans all over your lovely website, you know, and you can't stop them doing that. Or they might use high contrast color schemes of some kind. I use Samsung Internet Browser, for example, and that's got a high contrast mode, and that's just whacking another style sheet on top of everything and overriding stuff. It's just a little reminder that your website will never look as you intended it to look. You know, the user always has ultimate control over everything. But going back to the rules of the Cascade, we've got another one. We've got @rules. These are like simple if statements, you know, in CSS. It means when Cascade starts to get a little bit more logical. We think of things like media queries when we think of this. These are the most typical use case. But there's also other things. There's @support, there's font face, @import. There's all kinds of different ones out there. So yeah, so just recap, we've done source order inheritance. There's one more. And this one is the one that makes people, and programmers in particular, table flip. They hate this because everything else was pretty logical. Yeah, in CSS, it made sense. It had an internal consistency. But it is actually possible in CSS to do stupid things like this. You can come along, you can set all your beautiful styles, and then an important comes in and just messes it up, man. Fucks it right up. So, I've gone too far. Let's go back to this. Let's watch these GIFs again. It's fine. But there's a good reason for this. There's a good reason to have these. And this is partly for you, partly for the author. So if you are dealing with awful third-party CSS, you're importing stuff, yeah, and they put some hideous selectors in there or some terrible use of important themselves, then you have to override that in some way. And because the only thing that overrides important is another important, because it's worth infinity, that's quite a big number, you have to override infinity with another number, you have to do it like that. But also the users, we talked about users earlier with their own style sheets. They use important quite often because they don't know what selectors they have to override on any given website. They haven't got time to go and learn your website and learn to override your selectors that you've created. So that's why important exists, to just give them a final ace card that they can play and go, boom, this one is overriding everything. So it's an accessibility thing ultimately. But I still hate it. I still absolutely detest it. And if there was a way to get rid of important in the author layer of things, I would, you know, just disable it, put a switch in, boom, it would make me so happy. But we can't, you know. Wishes were horses. And all of this has led to some gentle criticisms of CSS. And by gentle criticisms, I mean vitriol and anger everywhere. And of the Cascade in particular. And we hear people saying things like, CSS is impossible to understand, or CSS is fundamentally broken. Which every time I see that, I just think of that fucking Peter Griffin gif, you know? The one that if it is ever used unironically, should be met with a taser shot. And is it broken? Is CSS broken? Or is it just different? Because it is not a programmatic language like we think of other things. You know, we think of JavaScript or PHP or something like that. It is not a programmatic language. It's a declarative language, which is a completely different thing. It only suggests what it wants to happen to the browser. And that's because the CSS and HTML, another declarative language, were born on the Weird Wild Web. And the Weird Wild Web is a place that is hostile to code. Users can modify CSS like we saw. Things can break. Networks can fail. But CSS copes with that all the time because it's fantastic. And at this point in the talk, I was going to do some lovely things about the future of CSS and how we can use the Cascade in our work. But I thought instead of doing that useful kind of stuff, I would just have a small rant. Because there's been some recent controversy, hasn't there, about how we write CSS. You know, you might have seen all the arguments on the internet about people arguing and saying, oh, this is good and this is bad, but with far more swearing language in there. And there's been a lot of criticisms with the way we write CSS and how it works. People say things like, oh, it's got this ridiculous lack of scope and everything is global and, you know, CSS leaks like a broken pipe. And I've been reading around about this. I've been doing my own research, you know. I've been digging deep into it. I haven't been digging that deep. I just did some Googling. And I found patient zero for that, the first cause of it, which is this. This is a slide from the React CSS and JavaScript talk. This has become a kind of a famous one now that people have been discussing. And this was written by a guy at Facebook who he had a little bit of a disastrous time getting engineers to write CSS. And as a solution to that, he proposed binding CSS directly to HTML components. You know, things that were generated by a JavaScript app, doing it directly there. And it would mean that each visual component would end up getting a unique class name and a unique selector on there. And these would tie directly. There'd be no sharing, there'd be no nothing. It's just each component on the page would have its own bunch of CSS. And this is what they'd look like in the end once they're actually generated. And this was fixing some perceived problems with CSS. You know, primarily the Cascade, that was seen as a problem. The perceived lack of CSS modularity and code isolation. And it ultimately came down to devs not really knowing the Cascade, and so they don't want to deal with it. You know, it's a difficult concept. It really is difficult to learn. It's like chess, it just gets harder as you go on. And they didn't want to deal with this. But I think that's a problem because, well, I understand where it comes from. I understand their reasoning behind this because CSS is not logical, is it? You know, it can be a bit bizarre at times. It's not the logical system that a lot of programmatic thinking people would like. But to me, it's as much art as code. It really is. And trying to twist it into a programmatic mindset and make it obey all the little rules and be good little programmatic code, I think it's just a little bit ultimately harmful to our industry. You know, it's trying to destroy something. But having said all this, and as weird as it might seem to those who know me, that miserable bitch who hates JavaScript, as someone once called me on the internet, there's some fantastic ideas underlying this whole controversy. Because no one wants to end up playing a game of Jenga with CSS, ever. We all want CSS that we can modify with ease. We want to be able to go in there confidently and do our work. And ignoring the actual implementation of CSS in JS, which I think is enormous over-engineering, and reinforces the notion that CSS is somehow inferior to JavaScript and must be saved from it. The criticisms of how people write CSS, using the global scope and a lack of modularization, they're valid. Those are really valid concerns that CSS and JS is trying to address. Because let's face it, developers do write shit CSS, don't they? We all have a tendency towards that. But especially when we're not CSS experts. You can come and find me later in the car park about opinions on full stack development, because I think it's terrible. Sorry, not sorry. CSS, unlike me, is non-opinionated, and it will let you write whatever terrible code you want to write. So the idea of giving structure of some kind when we write CSS is a fantastic one and really useful. And I think there's two main points that come out of this. We can learn to embrace the cascade, and we can learn to write focused components. Focused but reusable components, unlike CSS and JS. And I don't care what system you write it in. No, I do care. I do care. I have opinions on things, but I have to not have opinions, otherwise I'm going to have a heart attack at some point. Whether it's CSS and JS, whether it's Sass, post-CSS, stylus, less, or just writing CSS by hand, I don't care. Just pick one. And just follow 3 simple rules when you're doing it. So the first rule is just define global variables. Just define some and start yourself having a little design system, because this is ultimately what a design system is. It's a bunch of variabilized tokens. It can be simple, it can be huge, whatever. Then define your typography, which most of the time just comes down to defining how your paragraphs will look and your list items and stuff. Really simple. I'm not talking about anything spectacular here. Really simple. Set your colors, all that kind of thing. And then make use of the cascade. We talked about the inheritance mechanism. Let everything cascade out. I think Nicole Sullivan said she thought of the cascade as a beautiful waterfall, cascading down like that. And that's how I like to think about it. And then define your visual components and, get them mapped to semantic CSS, semantic HTML. It doesn't matter whether it's Sass or JavaScript, it's the same thing, just making a component as specific as possible. But making it 100% unique, again, still wasteful, I think. And ignores the power of CSS that's being given to us for free and reinforces that notion that it's something to fear. Because look at these 2 things. This is Sass and CSS and JS. They ultimately are doing exactly the same thing. The only difference, is the mechanism with how they're achieving that. One of them manually defines a name, one of them does it automatically. And this is no different, the stuff that CSS and JS is doing. This is no different to what good CSS authors have been doing for years. And dealing with the uniqueness of that name and the uniqueness of code has become something of a religious war with stuff. Because how do you enforce that uniqueness? How do you stop someone from redefining your CSS? And you can rely on 2 things. One of them could be you could rely on the robots to do it for you. You could rely on technology, tooling chains, figuring out auto binding, stuff like that, so that no one can ever possibly author a conflict. Or you can have faith in your developers. And you can trust them, you can train them, you can have experts in their field and let them do this for you. Both of them have ultimately exactly the same effect, whether it's machine or people who are doing it. And at my company, we like to trust developers to do it. We like to have front-end experts, CSS experts, and all of this. And we use just a dash of technological convention, just a little salting of it. And this diagram, all it represents is the order of import of our Sass partials. It's so simple. The ones at the top are most broad in scope, and the ones at the bottom are most specific. And this isn't anything new. This is based on stuff that you saw Harry talk earlier, Harry Roberts. This is based on his IT CSS concept, inverted triangle CSS. And it's beautiful, and it just works. Oh. And then the actual imports of our Sass partials look like this. They're just done in an ordered way. We put those global settings at the start. We talked about defining our global variables first. Then we do things like functions and mix-ins, define our typography, and then those focused components. It's boring. It's utterly boring, but it works, and it's rock solid. It's the kind of thing that is important for large organizations like ours, because it produces like really specific yet reusable code. And some people will freak out at that. They'll say, oh my God, but anybody could alter this. Anybody could mess with it. What about my precious code and my code isolation? And at our organization, we say that's fantastic. We want people to alter things. We want people to submit pull requests and discuss stuff and think about how these shared components can be reused everywhere. And I've been using this technique for years. Since me and Amy were working together, definitely. This has been like 8 years I've been using this. And I've never, honestly, once had this leaking CSS thing that people have been talking about. Just structure your CSS well, and it won't happen. Thanks, Michelle. It is a fantastic idea. Anyway, we're at the end of things now. I just wanted to summarize everything for you. So CSS has been around since the start. It's like chess. It's easy to learn at first, but it gets really hard quickly. There's been a lot of criticism of CSS. Most of it is undeserved. And the Cascade is amazing, and we should really, really make use of it. Focus components are amazing, and we should be doing that a lot more. We should be making use of the Cascade and focus components. There's no need for a religious war on this one. They're both doing ultimately the same thing. And we don't have to over-engineer. Most of you, probably none of you, are working for Facebook. We don't have to do things like they do at ginormous scale. We can just do sensible, easily managed things. Anyway, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Okay, we're running a bit over. If everyone's really hungry, you can file out.
Just walk out.
For everyone else who's interested in the questions, we've got some good ones.
Really?
First off, do you really like dogs or just the funny faces they make?
I really like dogs. They're amazing. They're the best thing, and I love their funny little faces.
Asking the real questions here. Okay, slightly more serious. How do you enforce best CSS authoring practices for onboarding junior devs?
We do, like I said, we do pull requests, we do mentoring, we do pair programming, we do all of those things at once. None of them are incompatible with each other. The hardest thing in web development is communication and talking with people. The code is the easy bit, honestly. We can just Google that, but you cannot Google just talking to people.
Any quick tips for best practices using CSS custom properties or variables? In a nutshell.
No.
Cool. yeah, do you use frameworks like Bootstrap?
No.
Okay.
That is ours. That is our framework. Yes!
Okay, we've got a couple of more. Do you see frameworks like Angular help making CSS more modular, being that the components have their own scope where you can add CSS specific to that component?
I hate Angular. I hate all JavaScript first in the client JavaScript. Everything. Yeah, start the rebellion. Yes.
Okay, one more. Do you think that by writing structured CSS code with, say, BEM and SMACSS, Drupal SSS coding standards, will make developers write better CSS code?
Yes, I do.
That's a yes.
Yeah, we should be doing.
Quick fire questions, these, aren't they?
I know they're quite good.
The questions are long, but the answers are short. Usually the other way around.
It's like you're talking more than me.
It feels like that.
Own it, Amy. Own me.
Okay, I think that's it. But the top upvoted, it's not a question, it just says, Hans says, can I just say I love you? Full stack, shit CSS. All right, Thank you so much. Give it up for Charlie Owen.